All right, welcome back. Here we are at chapter 6. Today we're going to be discussing biological and psychological explanations for crime. And so I want to start off just by saying that you have to be really careful when looking at biological and psychological explanations for crime, because as we discussed in our last chapter, there have been heavy social policy implications, things like locking up people before they've even committed any crimes, the idea of practicing lobotomies, where you would actually remove certain pieces of the brain, and essentially making people vegetables. And then again, like that eugenics movement, that forced sterilization, to help with the idea of, contributing to criminality. So our chapter objectives for chapter 6 are: we want to be familiar with the various biological explanations of crime and deviance, including phrenology, atavism, biological inferiority, body shapes, heredity and genetics, neurochemical mechanisms, diet and nutrition, and pregnancy and birth complications. We want to be able to critique the biological explanations that are discussed in the text, including the current stance of biological research in reference to race and criminality. We want to be familiar with the various psychological explanations of crime and deviance, including psychoanalytic explanations and the relationships between crime and moral development, intelligence, and personality. We also want to be able to critique the psychological explanations that are discussed in the text. All right, so here's a great question to kind of get you thinking and to get you engaging with these ideas. So do you think there's a biological component to the criminal behavior? Right. The answer to that is yes, there are biological components to criminal behavior. I will say take that with a grain of salt, because they only represent a very, very small sector of certain types of crimes, which we'll talk about in a second. There'll be a video for you to watch this chapter that looks at a doctor from University of Irvine, California, and he looks at brain scans to analyze psychopathic tendencies, and you'll find that the video I give you guys is really, really interesting. But he has found that many psychopaths are people who have committed things like serial killers or really horrible, horrendous acts, do show some damage to their frontal lobe. But he also says that these individuals also share, there's some type of environmental trigger that happens. So maybe a really poor home life, things like that. And so, generally keep in mind that most psychopaths or sociopaths don't go on to become serial killers. Interestingly enough, this might be a little scary, but about 4% of the population has psychopathic tendencies, or sociopathic tendencies, meaning they may or may not have had some environmental influence. So, for instance, most people in politics, interestingly enough, carry psychopathic tendencies. And think about it, like you have to have some major ego to think that you can be the leader of the free world, right? And so you do, and in some ways, there's a function for them in our society. We need people to have, leaders to have that amount of confidence. On the flip side, that's why our forefathers set in the checks and balances and things like that to ensure that not one person would, exceed their powers and overdo it. So, the idea of those sociopaths, what I was going to say is, yeah, they're there, and most of them don't go on to become serial killers. Most of them are just really big jerks. And so, if you think that you've experienced someone who doesn't care about anyone else, it is quite possible that they are a sociopath. So that's just something to think about. I think I've met a few in my life. So anyways. All right, so the first kind of study that we're going to look at is what's known as phrenology. And phrenology was a theory that was brought up by a man named Franz Joseph Gall, and he hypothesized that the shape of a human skull could indicate things like personality and could be used to predict things like criminality. If you look in the picture, you can see all the different types. And, those types of things are associated with, there are parts of your brains that are associated with language and things like wit or impulse control, stuff like that. So, I mean, there is some truth to this, but you'll definitely see that there are some problems with these ideas as well. So Gall believed that the three major regions of the brain governed three types of behavior, which were your personality, your intellectual or your moral capacity, and that the lower type was associated with things like criminal behavior, and that would be largest in criminals. Of course, because of the time that Gall was working in, he couldn't, do brain scans. They didn't have them, so he would go in and actually measure the skull, and he reasoned that like larger skulls and the kind of clunkier heads were more likely to engage and have these criminal elements, and of course this really clashed with the ideas of the Enlightenment and are no longer considered scientific at all, pseudoscience again. So next we have Cesar Lombroso, and his theory was of what's known as atavism, and he believed that criminals were evolutionary throwbacks, that these were people who had primitive urges that were able to survive but hadn't fully evolved into modern day humans. Again, so they were just more primitive, more like a caveman type situation. So it was interesting because Lombroso, who was Italian at the time, he was studying Italian prisoners, and he looked at things like arms. He found that arms and legs were abnormally long. They had larger skulls. They were hairier. They had bigger jaws, things like that. And of course, his research was flawed because many of these prisoners hadn't committed the crime at that time. In Italy, and still I believe today, Sicilians were more associated with crime, and these were characteristics, like physical characteristics, that were more associated with them. So there was a lot of discrimination. They were also at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And of course, later these ideas of atavism were discredited as being pseudoscience as well. All right, so we also had a theorist named William Sheldon, and he used measurement techniques to connect body types with personalities. And so came up with three different body types that he believed were associated with criminality. So the first one is the ectomorph, and ectomorph is a thin individual. He believed that the personality type was introverted. This person was overly sensitive. And again, this is known as somatology. The mesomorph is the next one he coined, and this person was athletic. They had more of an aggressive personality, and these were the people who are more apt to commit violent crime, especially types of crime that involve strength or speed, because of course these people could run away. Lastly, he coined the term endomorph, which was an individual who was heavier, had short arms, was more relaxed. He believed that the criminal or the personality type was more associated with being extroverted. He believed that, this person was more of a non-criminal kind of sense. And I think some of these ideas are still in our culture today in certain stereotypes as, someone a little pudgier being, funny, or I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. So yeah, I mean, so even looking at certain body types, and again, all of these were later discredited as being, pseudoscience. All right, so here's some stuff that's kind of interesting. At this slide, we're looking at some of the neurochemical substances, things like hormones and neurotransmitters. And this is why perhaps men have higher levels of offending. It looked at testosterone, or the male hormone, as linked to aggression. Because we also know that when women take testosterone, like synthetic testosterone, they also become more aggressive. And so, this was used to help explain why men were more aggressive and more likely to engage in criminality. This research was questioned because it might perhaps be that offending often releases more testosterone. And this is true if you think of adrenaline. I know most of you have not committed, major criminal acts, but you can only imagine the type of adrenaline that would be pulsating through your veins. And I think we see this in Hollywood a lot with movies and things like that. There has to be a high that comes with this. So it's kind of that idea: is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the testosterone that's causing the aggressiveness, or is it that adrenaline that's causing your testosterone levels to increase? Um, so yeah. All right, so other behavioral genetic factors. Ways that we might look at this. So, does crime run in families? Are criminal tendencies inherited in your genes in the same way you can inherit like a cancer gene or something? So, ways that we might study this would be looking at twin studies, so biological twins. If crime is inherited, you would find much higher concordance, meaning when one twin carries the criminal element, you'll see it with the others. This is true when compared to other sub-siblings. So when you have one who's more likely to engage, but it's really hard with this to find if, is this because there's a genetic factor to criminality, or is it because, siblings hang out together in the same way that twins hang out together? Um, it's kind of hard to say really what it is, what's happening. But it's interesting because when twins are reared apart, so you have biological twins raised in similar socioeconomic settings, it is very rare that you would have both twins being engaging in criminality. So that's an interesting kind of component to this. There's also talk about what's known as the XYY supermale. These are males who actually have an extra Y on their chromosome, or an extra Y chromosome, and they're associated with having very low intelligence. They have higher arrests. This is known as the warrior gene. I will say, though, they represent a very small percentage of the criminal population. So a lot of this, there's just not enough evidence to, really analyze all of this. There's just not enough twins and things like that. All right. So you're probably thinking, what the heck is a Twinkie doing on the PowerPoint? What does that have to do? Well, the Twinkie is there because there was what was known as the Twinkie defense, and this defense was associated with the gay activist Harvey Milk. If you ever watched the film Milk, great movie. But Harvey Milk was assassinated by another person in government who he's working with, and this person was kind of jealous of Harvey's success, especially being a gay male in the 70s. And he was outraged and really jealous and ended up killing him and another government official. And he claimed the Twinkie defense, and he said that his blood sugar level had gotten so bad and he had eaten too many Twinkies, and there was a rush of sugar. And anyways, that was why he had committed these murders. And you might go, how ridiculous! This is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Well, get this: he ended up getting off on this idea that he was hypoglycemic, or he had low sugar level. And he didn't get off. He got 4 years for killing two people, which I think is essentially getting off. He ended up eventually going on to kill himself. So I guess that worked out. Anyways, other chemical imbalances. There's one, get this is an interesting one. Women have claimed the defense of PMS, that premenstrual syndrome actually prompted them to commit crime. And 2 women were actually given probation. This was years ago, based on claiming PMS as a defense. I would not recommend this defense. I would not do that. It's obviously very controversial. Another idea of how chemical imbalances can contribute to criminality. We know that low levels of serotonin is linked to higher levels of depression. right? So serotonin is that happy chemical that is let out in the brain. So, more depressed people. We also know things like prisoners dream less, and dreams allow for people to kind of live vicariously, to do things they wouldn't normally do in real life. You reflect on your dreams, oftentimes we're having sex with people we shouldn't be having sex with, or just, I don't know, there's all these different types of things that we do in our dreams, right? We kill, we do all types of things, punch people. So the dreams allow us to live a bit more vicariously. But there is a study that says that prisoners actually dream less. So that's kind of an interesting idea associated with chemical imbalances. All right. So as I mentioned before, we have to be really critical of some of these biological and psychological theories because they can carry really horrible social implications to say that certain groups are biologically inferior to others. So for instance, so now we're going to look at some of these evaluations. First of all, we might say that crime is just too diverse. So biological explanations might explain some crime, but it doesn't account for all. It really can't account for what's known as the relativity of deviance, or why some people turn to crime and others turn to exercise to release extra energy. Why do some people become war heroes as opposed to like gangsters or something like that? So I mean there are lots of variations as to why would someone turn to one behavior as opposed to criminology when they have that excessive chemicals or whatever. We also find that there are a lot of methodological problems or problems when garnering this research. So for instance, why would inner cities have higher crime rates if all were biological? Um, and this is true. You see higher crime rates in inner cities, whether it be America, Great Britain, any other westernized country, there are higher crime rates. So why is that happening? Location. That has nothing to do with uh, what we're talking about here. Next, as we're talking, it can account for different group differences or group rate differences. Um, other things like social policy implications. Obviously, this would infer that to reduce crime, we must actually change biology, and that would be really bad. We can't go there, and we have a little chance of reducing crime if we go there. Also, things like um, viewing people as biologically inferior, because obviously we focus so much more on street crime. So we're looking at the poor and essentially saying that they are poor and inferior.